proud, too, of our students whose energy, commitment, and compassion provides an answer to a question recently asked by Nobel Peace Prize recipient and Holocaust survivor, Elie Wiesel. Mr. Wiesel wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine, "Am I naive in believing that medicine is still a noble profession, upholding the highest ethical principles? For the ill, doctors still stand for life, and for all of us, hope. For all of us, hope." My answer to Mr. Wiesel would be, no, you are not naive. And yes, medicine is still a noble profession. And today's commencement speaker is the epitome of nobility in our profession. Dr. Benjamin Solomon Carson is a world-renowned neurosurgeon and is currently the director of the Division of Neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins University, where he is a professor of neurosurgery, plastic surgery, oncology, and pediatrics. He is also co-director of the Johns Hopkins Craniofacial Center. Dr. Carson's pioneering work in the separation of twins joined at the back of the head was perhaps a fitting realization of the middle name of Solomon given to him by his beloved mother, Sonia. This coincidence, Dr. Carson has said, is proof that God has a sense of humor. Dr. Carson credits his mother for believing in him when no one else did. She did not allow him to fulfill the nickname of dummy given to him by his classmates. She insisted he write 2 book reports a week, reports she herself struggled to read. Her answer to any excuse for poor performance was prophetic. "Benjamin," she would scold, "you have a brain, don't you?" Well, I think we know the answer to that question, but we also know that Miss Carson's son has so much more. He has an invincible heart and the unshakable foundation of a faith that says that service to our fellow human beings is the sole purpose of our existence. It is that heart and that belief that led Dr. Carson and his wife Candy, who joins Dr. Carson here today, to establish the Carson Scholarship Fund, and they have also established the Angel of the Operating Room Endowment. And it is that heart that brings him here today to share his message of hope and inspiration with you. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Benjamin Solomon Carson.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Congratulations to the graduates, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this momentous day. It's wonderful to be here. It's my first time in Galveston. I've been to Texas many times before. And to see, again, such luminary figures from Hopkins as Dr. Stobo and Dr. Nada, and many other friends. I want to talk a little bit today not only about who we are as physicians, but who we are as extraordinarily well-educated and privileged people. You know, medicine has really been the only thing that ever interested me as a youngster. I can remember particularly being impressed in church and Sabbath school hearing about the missionary doctors who traveled all over the world at great personal expense to bring not only physical, but also mental and spiritual healing to people. And it seemed to me like they were the most noble people on the face of the earth. And I decided that that's what I wanted to do from the time I was 8 years old until I was 13. At which time, having grown up in dire poverty, I decided I'd rather be rich. So at that point, missionary doctor was out and psychiatrist was in. Now, I didn't know any psychiatrists, but on television they seemed like very rich people. You know, they drove Jaguars, had these big fancy mansions, big plush offices, and all they had to do was talk to crazy people all day. And it seemed like I was doing that anyway, so I said, you know, this is going to work out extremely well. And, you know, I started reading psychology the day I was the local shrink in high school. Everybody would bring me their problems, and I would stroke my chin, say, tell me about your mama, you know. And, and I majored in psychology in college. I did advanced psych in medical school, and I was gung-ho. I was really ready. And then I started meeting a bunch of psychiatrists. Need I say more? No, I'm just, just kidding. Some of my best friends are psychiatrists. But what I discovered very quickly is that what psychiatrists do in real life and what they do on television are two completely different things. And what they do in real life is obviously much more important than what they do on television. They're some of the more intellectual members of the medical community. But it wasn't what I wanted to do, and I really had to stop at that point and say, now what? After spending all of those years thinking I was moving in that direction. But you know, I believe God gives everybody special gifts and talents. So I said, well, what are your special gifts and talents? And I started thinking back on my life. I realized I had a lot of eye-hand coordination, the ability to think in 3 dimensions. I was a very careful person. I never knocked things over and said, oops, which is a great characteristic for a neurosurgeon, by the way. And I love to dissect things. So that's really how I came to the conclusion that really I should move into the arena of neurosurgery. And I started out as an adult neurosurgeon, and then I quickly discovered that no matter how good an operation you did on those chronic back pain patients, they never got any better until they got their settlement. And whereas with the kids, what you see is what you get. When they feel good, you know they feel good. When they feel bad, you know they feel bad. And you could spend 12, 14, 15, 16 hours operating on a complex tumor, for instance, in a little kid. And if you're successful, your reward may be 30, 40, 50, 60 years of life. Whereas with an old geezer, you do all that work and they die in 5 years of something else. So, you know, I like to get a big return on my investment, so I started concentrating more on the kids. Now, let me tell you, I have discovered over the years, I have to do a disclaimer here. You know, because we all have to give disclaimers now. You know, I'm on the board of Pfizer or this or that or the other, so what I say may be tainted by those relationships. Well, here's my disclaimer. I've discovered over the years that whenever you speak to a large group of people today, you're going to offend somebody. Because people are so easy to offend these days. You know, when I was a kid, they used to say, sticks and stones break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Nowadays, names slaughter people. And I remember I was talking to a group one time about the difference between a human brain and a dog's brain. And a man got offended. He said, you can't talk about dogs like that. And I was talking about how the fashion industry has gotten the young women to think they're supposed to be so skinny they look like they escaped from Auschwitz. And a Jewish man said, you can't talk about that. That's too sensitive. It would be as if I said something to you about slavery. And I told him, you can talk about slavery all you want. It doesn't bother me. But, you know, some people do tend to get offended. So my disclaimer is the following. It is not my intention to offend anyone today. And if anyone is offended, too bad. Now, you know, there were a lot of problems along the way, me realizing my dream of becoming a physician, not the least of which was the fact that I was a horrendous student. You know, I was the person in the back of the room always shooting paper wads and telling jokes and trying to get other people in trouble. I love getting other people in trouble. And getting other students kicked out of class was my favorite thing because I wouldn't be the only one who didn't learn anything that day. And I was good at it, I gotta tell you. I was a professional. I would study my classmates and I would figure out what made them really, really angry. And then I would just irritate them until they were about to explode, but I would never push the last button until the teacher was nearby. Then they would explode and the teacher would kick them out and I would say, yes, this is great. And so I remember once there was this young lady and she was like Miss Goody Two-Shoes. She never did anything wrong, always had her work on time, teacher's pet, absolutely perfect. And I said, boy, wouldn't it be great to get her kicked out of class? So I started studying her, and I figured out what made her angry. I tell you, the steam was coming out of her ears. She was about to explode, but I didn't push the last button. waited till we were in class. Lo and behold, she sat right down in the seat in front of me. I said, the Lord is good. And as the teacher approached, I pushed the last button, but she didn't explode. She just quietly turned around, and she said, you and me on the playground at recess. So that didn't work out too well, you know. I became a neurosurgeon, and she became a professional wrestler. But, but you know, I was just a very, very poor student. And unfortunately, I find that there are many such students still. You know, I have a program at the hospital, and I bring in 800 students at a time. I do this on a regular basis. And I show them slides of the human brain and the kinds of things that go on in the academic center. And we talk about various careers and human potential. And at the end, I allow them to ask me questions. And I remember asking the question once, how many of you can name for me 5 NBA players? Do you know virtually everybody could name 5 NBA players? How about 5 Major League Baseball players? No problem. NFL, football, no problem. Rap singers, piece of cake, movie stars, they could name them. I said, who can name for me 5 Nobel Prize winners? Out of 800, 10 hands went up. I said, leave your hands up because I'm going to call on one of you. All the hands went down. And then I said, well, wait, this is the information age, the technological age. Who can tell me what a microprocessor is? Of course, they were all very weary by now. Only one young man raised his hand. I called upon him. He proudly stood up and he said, a microprocessor is a tiny processor. That was it. That was the extent of his knowledge. Extraordinarily superficial. And, you know, this is a problem. You know, there was a survey done some years ago looking at the ability of students in 22 nations to solve so-called complex math and science problems. We ranked number 21 out of 22. We only beat out one country, and we barely beat them out. It was neck and neck. And that is extraordinarily worrisome. We produce 60,000 engineers in this country each year, 40% of whom are foreigners. China produces 392,000 engineers a year. My wife and I were having dinner with Craig Barrett, the chairman of Intel, not long ago, and he said they have to import all their technical skill now from China and Japan and India and Pakistan and South Korea. This is a problem. Now, it is true that right now, we, the United States of America, are the pinnacle nation in the world. But we're not the first pinnacle nation. There have been others before us, ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome. Pinnacle nations, number one, no competition, going to be there forever. At least that's what they thought. Where are they now? What happened to each and every one of them? Exactly the same thing. They became enamored of sports, entertainment, lifestyles of the rich and famous. They lost their moral compass, and they went right down the tubes. And some people say, that can't happen to us. But you know, the fact of the matter is, an honest appraisal would show you that it's already in the process of happening. And the real question is, can we be the first people in the history of the world to learn from those who preceded us and not go down that same pathway of self-destruction? You look at what's important in our society, and it really is pretty embarrassing. Except for when there's an election going on, we don't talk about how important education is. You know, we'd rather talk about Anna Nicole Smith and this other little skinny chick who's going to jail. You know, we want to talk about that stuff, you know? That is completely unimportant. And it really pains me, particularly when you think about the heritage of this nation. This nation which emerged in the shadow of the greatest empire on earth, the British Empire, a bunch of ragtag militiamen who were able to defeat that power. This, a nation which during World War II was the only thing that stood between tyranny in the entire world and freedom, as all of those nations were falling like dominoes, one by one. This nation had the ability to send its young men from the city, the suburbs, the country, to fight a war on two fronts of the world. The ability to send its women into the factories to produce more airplanes, tanks, and mortars than anybody could imagine. A country that with its industrial might saved the world. A country earlier with its breadbasket ability to produce more corn, wheat, and barley than anyone saved the world and led the world. But we're no longer in the agricultural age. We're no longer in the industrial age. Now we're in the information age, the technological age. And the real question is, what can we do about it? Physicians are the most highly educated people in our society. And there was a time when we were more liberal with the use of that education. Over the last few decades, we have withdrawn into our operating rooms and our clinics and our laboratories. And we have not allowed society to benefit from that vast, vast intelligence. And that is something that I believe we are going to have to change if we want to change the direction of the country, because we have such enormous influence. Everybody has a physician. So the ripple effect of influence is absolutely mind-boggling if you stop and think about it. Well, at any rate, there I was, this incredibly underachieving student, and my mother was the only one who believed in me and made me read books. And interestingly enough, I didn't like it very much, but within the space of a year and a half, after all that reading, I began to know things that nobody else knew. And I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class. And by the time I was in the 7th grade, the same students used to call me dummy in the 5th grade would say, Benny, how do you work this problem? And I'd say, sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you. I was perhaps a little obnoxious, but it sure felt good to say that to those turkeys. But, you know, the difference was I had a completely different mindset. And we think about all of those young people out there who could benefit from a little bit of direction, which you as physicians will be able to give, and a little bit of guidance. And you think about the human brain, the most fabulous organ system in the universe. There is nothing that even comes close to the complexity of your brain. It can process more than 2 million bits of information per second. It remembers everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever heard. Sometimes you might not think that when you're taking an exam, but in fact, it really does. And to give you an example of how complex your brain is, how many of you remember when your birthday is? Let me just see your hand. Okay, you didn't party too late. That's good. Now, what did your brain have to do for you to respond to that question? Well, first of all, the sound waves had to leave my lips, travel through the air, enter your external auditory meatus, travel down to your tympanic membrane, set up a vibratory force, which traveled across the ossicles of the middle ear to the oval and round window, set up a vibratory force in the inner lymph, which mechanically distorted the microcilia, converting mechanical energy to electrical energy, which traveled across the cochlear nerve to the cochlear nucleus at the pontomedullary junction, from there to the superior olivary nucleus, sending bilaterally up the brainstem to the lateral meniscus, to the inferior colliculus and the medial geniculate nuclei, across the thalamic radiations to the posterior temporal lobes, begin auditory processing, from there to the frontal lobes, coming down the tract of Victor's jury, inhibiting memory from the medial hippocampus, from the mammary bodies, back to the frontal lobes to start the motor response to the bed cell level, coming down the corticospinal tract, across the internal capsule into the cerebral peduncle, descending down to the cervical medullary decussation into the spinal gray matter, synapsing there, going out to the neuromuscular junction, stimulating the nerve and the muscle, so you could raise your hand. And that, of course, that, as you know, now, see if you can get one of those rap singers to do that. But that's the simplified version, you know. Now, if we wanted to get into all the complexities and coordination, we've been here all day talking about that one little thing that you did almost instantaneously with that enormous brain. So with brains like that, why would we ever say something like, I can't? But, you know, you would think that having realized all of that, life was really going to be wonderful for me. But when I got to high school, I ran into the worst thing a young person can run into. It's called peers, negative peers. PEERS. That stands for People Who Encourage Errors, Rudeness, and Stupidity. And that's exactly what they were doing. And and I started listening, and I went from an A student to a B student to a C student. And my grades kept plummeting, and I didn't care because I was cool. High fives, low five, pats on the back, doing the Detroit strut. I was cool. And fortunately, it was only a year that I wasted before my mother, again, was able to get me to realize that it wasn't what you wore on the outside, but what you had up here that made the difference. And I got back on the right track. And the guys didn't like it, and they were calling me nerd, Poindexter, Uncle Tom. But, I really didn't care what they had to say, and I would always say one thing to them that would shut them up. I'd say, let's see what I'm doing in 20 years, and let's see what you're doing in 20 years. We'll see who's right. And it was interesting. It was interesting because when I graduated from high school, they all voted me most likely to succeed, which means that they knew what was necessary to succeed. They were just too lazy and trifling to do it themselves. And that's what negative peer pressure is all about. But you will find negative peer pressure everywhere, way beyond high school. You will find it in the halls of the hospital. You will find people who give you bad information. You will find people who will try to get you to believe that you're better than somebody else. And I'll tell you something. It is to your benefit not to buy into that. Talk to the janitors and the people who clean the ORs and the ward clerks. They can be your greatest allies. I tell you, when I was an intern and a resident, I knew everything that was going on because I knew those people. And if one of the ward clerks overheard something where maybe I had neglected to do something and I was going to get in trouble, you better believe they called me. And they said, and I would get it taken care of. Those people can be your friends, and it makes your life a whole lot easier. Also, people will tell you, don't get emotionally involved with your patients. Now, I have not discovered how to do that yet. When I'm looking at that brain of that little child, I'm thinking, that could be my child. And I will never be able to do that, I hope. Remember, it does cause pain, though. That part is correct. When you become emotionally involved and something happens, it does cause pain. There was one family from New York, and they brought their little girl in who was having intractable seizures. For those of you who are not medically oriented, nothing could be done to stop the seizures. And I began to talk to that family about a hemispherectomy, an operation in which we take out half of the brain. And it became so clear to me that that little girl was the apple of their eye, was the center of their universe. We had so many warm and pleasant conversations. And I was just thinking how wonderful it will be to be able to give this family back their little girl without seizures. And the day came for that operation, and there was a lot of anticipation. And I performed the operation, and it went so smoothly. And I remember coming out of that operating room, and there was just such joy and hugs. And I was just on cloud nine. I almost floated home that night. And I almost was home, and my beeper started going off. And I called the ICU and found out that that child had arrested. And I rushed back to the hospital. And after 40 minutes of resuscitative efforts, it was clear that that child would not survive. And I remember standing next to that cold, lifeless body and thinking about those warm conversations and how much this child meant to that family. And it just tears at your heartstrings. And I felt like the most lonely person on the face of the earth that day. And I couldn't control the tears as I stood there. And then I felt an arm around one shoulder, an arm around the other shoulder. And I looked up, and it was the mother and the father of that child. And they said, "Doctor, we love you, and we know you did everything you could for our child. And if you ever have reluctant parents and you need somebody to talk to them, call on us." And I'll tell you, that's the kind of reaction you get when you become emotionally involved. And does it hurt? It does, for a little while. but you know that you've done everything that you can, and you're able to move on. It makes all the difference in the world. I remember another time I was going to be in the operating room all night, and I always see all of my patients. So I told the circulating nurse to call all the floors where I had patients and make sure the nurses knew that I wouldn't be around that evening and to let my patients know. And the next day when I was making rounds, I went into one young lady's room, and she was just so happy. She said, "Oh, Dr. Carson, that was so wonderful. I know you didn't come last night, but all the nurses came in my room, and we had such a good time, and it was better than if you had come." But, but you know, it's just so nice, you know, when you let people know that you care. Also, you know, when I got back on the right track in high school, going back to that, I had one big goal. I wanted to be a contestant on a television program called GE College Bowl. Now, all you graduates are too young to remember that. But are there any other people here who remember GE College? Oh, yeah, there are several old people. Okay. Now, this was my favorite show. It came on every Sunday. They have two colleges pitted against each other. They would ask questions about science, math, history, geography, and I was really good at those things. But they would also ask questions about art and classical music. There was no way you were going to learn anything about that at Southwestern High School in inner city Detroit. I mean, in my high school, if you said something about Van Gogh, they would have said, "Put gas in it, the van will go." I mean, they would have no idea what you were talking about. So, you know, I just made an executive decision. I would get on the bus day after day, week after week, month after month, travel downtown to the Detroit Institute of Arts, roam through those galleries until I knew every picture, who painted them, when they were born, when they died, what period it represented, always listening to my portable radio, Bach, Telemann, Mozart. Kids in Detroit thought I was nuts. I mean, a black kid in Motown listening to Mozart, they thought I was absolutely nuts. And I tried to convince them that the Mo in Motown meant Mozart, but nobody was buying that. And I even determined which college I was going to attend based on that program. Because I had enough money to apply to one college, I said, I'm applying to the college that wins the grand championship in college ball. Well, that year, the grand championship was between Harvard and Yale. And Yale just demolished Harvard, so I didn't want to go to school with a bunch of dummies. So, you know, I applied to Yale. See, I probably offended somebody. But at any rate, when I went to Yale, that was the year that College Bowl went off the air. So, you know, I know it's sad. But, you know, I didn't get a chance to be on it. But years later, when I decided that I wanted to be a neurosurgeon, I said, I'm going to apply to the place that's best known for neurosurgery. Of course, that's Johns Hopkins, Cushing, Dandy, Walker, all the biggest names. The only problem was they only took 2 people a year out of 125 applicants. How was I going to get to be one of them? Well, when I went for my interview, the fellow who was in charge of the residency program was also in charge of cultural affairs at the hospital. And we talked a little bit about medicine and neurosurgery. Somehow the conversation turned to classical music. We talked for over an hour about different composers and their styles, conductors, orchestras, orchestral halls. There was no way he wasn't taking me in the program, because he had to have somebody to discuss this stuff with. And you know, some people say that certain types of knowledge are useless, but the point is they are not useless. And as physicians, it is imperative that we not limit ourselves. Not limit ourselves to just science, but get out there and think about politics. Think about, because we have a food stamp program, which works very effectively. They get a monthly allocation. They don't go out the first 5 days and buy porterhouse steak and starve the rest of the month. They learn to portion things out. People would do the same thing if we had like an electronic medical account that was replenished each month. Now when Mr. Smith has that diabetic ulcer on his foot, instead of going to the emergency room and blowing half of his account, he's going to go to the clinic. The difference is they would fix you up in both places, but in the emergency room they send you out. In the clinic they say, Mr. Smith, now let's get your diabetes under control so you're not back here in 3 weeks with another problem. A whole nother level of savings. But the people who are going to have to do that are us. It's your generation, because my generation dropped the ball, quite frankly. And we turned over all those kinds of decisions to people who were not medical people, and you can see what a mess they've made out of it. And the fact of the matter is, you know, you look at the healthcare dollars. 39 cents on a healthcare dollar goes to pay administrative costs. That's the lion's share of the thing. You know, only 19 cents goes to pay professional fees. And that's just one small area where you can see how we who understand the system, who really have compassion, can make a difference. And I think that's what we're going to have to do. Finally, what is success? Is it a big house and a lot of cars and a lot of fancy degrees? I don't think so. You know, in 1997, I was asked if I would come to South Africa to head up a team in an attempt to separate type 2 vertical craniopagus twins. Siamese twins joined at the top of the head facing in opposite directions. There have been 13 attempts to do that before, none of which have been successful. So I knew it was going to be a great medical challenge. But it was also going to be a great social challenge because the operation was to be done at the Medical University of South Africa at Madunza, the only major black teaching hospital in South Africa. Always the stepchild throughout apartheid and in the post-apartheid period. This was going to be their chance to stand shoulder to shoulder with Cape Town and Johannesburg and all the other great universities. Well, I wasn't ready for all that social pressure. I said, Lord, you got to show me something here because smarter and more capable people than me have tried and have failed. And as I was studying the various radiographs using our three-dimensional virtual reality system, I realized that the common drainage system that they shared was a little narrower centrally than it was peripherally. And the traditional neurosurgical literature said you should decide which twin to give the drainage system to and divide them over the course of several operations with months or weeks in between so that they could develop collateral circulation. But I felt impressed that if we concentrated on the area where the vessels were narrowing down, that we would be able to do this all in one operation. When I explained that to the team, they said, you're the boss. We'll do whatever you want to do. And I remember going to that operating room 2 days before New Year's of '98. There was a big sign over the OR that said, God bless Joseph and Luca Banda. They were having song service and prayer service. I was thrilled. I asked them to bring a stereo in so we could play inspirational music. 19 hours into the operation, we were only 3/4 of the way finished. The part that remained was so complex, the vessels were engorged, they were entangled, they were adhesed. It looked impossible. And we went into conference. I suggested we cover the area over with skin, come back in several months. They would have developed enough collaterals that we could cut through. And the doctors from Zambia and South Africa said, a great idea, but we can't keep partially separated twins alive. They'll die. Now I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders as I went back in there with my loops, my scalpel, and a prayer on my lips. And I said, Lord, it's up to you. Started cutting between those blood vessels that were so thin you could see the anesthetic bubbles coursing through, just daring you to make a nick in them. Make a long story short, when I made the final cut that separated those two twins over the stereo system came the Hallelujah chorus. Everybody had goosebumps, and when we finished that operation after 28 hours, one of those twins popped his eyes open and reached up for the endotracheal tube. The other one did the same thing. By the time we got to the ICU, within 2 days they were extubated. Within 3 days they were eating. Within 2 weeks they were crawling. And today they're graduating from the 5th grade. But you know that wasn't the success. The success you had to be there to witness was the reaction of the people who had been following the story so closely. Their level of self-esteem was so high they were literally dancing in the streets. And that's what I mean by success, using the talent that God has given you to elevate other people. And that's what I mean when I say think big. Each one of those letters means something special. The T is for talent, which God gave to every single person. Not just the ability to sing and dance and throw a ball, but intellectual talent. We must emphasize that. And we must reward that. It's the only thing that's going to change it for us. And if you're curious, when you go home, go to www.carsonscholars.org to find out how we can do that. The H is for honesty. Lead a clean and honest life. You don't put skeletons in the closet because they will come back to haunt you. And if you always tell the truth, you don't have to try to remember what you said 3 months ago. The I is for insight, which comes from listening to people who've already gone where you're trying to go. The N is for nice. Be nice to people. Because once they get over their suspicion of why you're being nice, they'll be nice to you. You can get so much more done when you're being nice and they're being nice. And can we all take the niceness pledge? Just raise your hand right where you are. All hands up. Audience too. Everybody. If the person beside you doesn't have their hand up, you may kick them, okay? Because it's the last time you can get away with it, okay? Because now we're going to be nice. You can put your hands down. Now, what did you just pledge to do? You pledged to be nice to every single person you encounter for 1 week, okay? That includes spouses too. Everybody for 1 week. Now, what does that mean? That means no talking about people behind their back for a week. Now, I realize some people will stroke out. It means you're going to help people who are struggling. Men, it means we're bringing chivalry back. We're holding the doors for the ladies. We're holding the chairs for them. Ladies, we're not cursing them out when they do that. There's only one spot on the elevator you're going to let somebody else get on. And when you're on the elevator, you're not going to act like you never saw the numbers change before. Speak to people. You may have to practice CPR, but speak to people. Talk to guards, talk to janitors, talk to maids, talk to people you just walk by and act like they don't exist, because they do, and they have feelings, and they're just as important as you are. You're going to get in your car. There's no more parking spaces. 3 people are following you in their car because they want your space. You're not going to get in the car and open the glove box and pull down the mirror. Just get out of the space and let them have it. You don't have to revel in your power. But what are you doing during that week? Thinking about others first. What kind of society could we have if we all thought about others first? And who better to lead that charge than physicians who are trained to be compassionate people? The K is for knowledge, which is the thing that makes you into a more valuable person. Do I have a big house? Yes. Do I have a lot of cars? Yes. I grew up in Detroit, like cars. All the things that Robin Leach thinks are important? Yes. Are they important? No, they mean nothing. If they all disappeared tomorrow, I don't care, because I can get them all right back with what's up here, or at least I could before managed care. And that's what Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, meant when he said, gold, silver, and rubies are nice, but be treasured far above those things, knowledge, wisdom, and understanding, because he knew with those you could get all the gold and silver and rubies you wanted. And more importantly, you'd come to understand they don't amount to a hill of beans, that the most important thing is using that God-given talent to elevate other people. The B is for books, which is the mechanism for obtaining that knowledge. You've had plenty of experience with that. The second I is for in-depth learning, learning for the sake of knowledge and understanding, as opposed to superficial learning. Those are people who cram before a test and 3 weeks later know nothing. I'm sure no one here knows anyone like that. But that's how we got to be number 21 out of 22. We have to change that. And the last letter, G, is for God. You know, there are a lot of people who are trying to kick God out of our country. I think that's a huge mistake. And you know, some lawyers came to us a few years ago and they said, you can't put your Think Big banners up in public schools because the G stands for God. And the First Amendment says there can be no government support of religious expression. Well, I reminded them that the First Amendment also says there can be no government suppression of religious expression. So we had a rather vigorous argument, and I suggested that we resolve it at the level of the Supreme Court, which seems like a bold and reckless statement, but it really wasn't, because I knew the very next week I was going to the Supreme Court to receive the Jefferson Award. So I figured I would ask while I was there, and I did, and Justice Sandra Day O'Connor said they were all wet, and of course they had no idea what they were talking about. Of course you could put it up. And people who say silly stuff like that, I wonder if they realize that our founding document, our Declaration of Independence, talks about certain inalienable rights given to us by our Creator, a.k.a. God. Do they realize that the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag says we're one nation under God? That most courtrooms in the land on the wall, it says, in God we trust. Every coin in our pocket, every bill in our wallet says, in God we trust. So, if it's in our founding documents, it's in our pledge, it's in our courts, and it's on our money, but we're not supposed to talk about it, what in the world is that? As you know from your psychiatry rotation, that's called schizophrenia. And doesn't that explain a lot of what's going on in our country today? And we need to make it perfectly clear as we go forth from here that it's okay to live by godly principles of loving your fellow man, of caring about your neighbor, of developing your God-given talents to the utmost so that you become valuable to the people around you, of having values and principles that govern your life. And if we do that, not only will you make a profound difference in the practice of medicine, not only will we remain a pinnacle nation, but we will truly have one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Congratulations.